Hello and welcome to Insight with Beyond the Headlines and Political Tours. The UK's handling of the coronavirus pandemic has been widely criticised. But what's it been like to report on it? Over this next hour, we'll be talking to Andrew Testa, a freelance photographer who works predominantly for the New York Times. We're going to start by talking to Andrew for about 15 minutes or so and look at a slideshow. Then we'll take Q&A. Please put your questions in the Q&A box just below here. We also want you to stay on at the top of the hour so we can discuss and give our own views about this debate. Please raise your hand if you've got a point to make. Andrew, just by way of introduction, can you say a bit about yourself? And then I know we've got your photos here that we're going to look at, which give an overview of the past few months here in the UK. Andrew, you go ahead.
Started late 80s. I was a freelance, always been a freelance. Started with The Guardian, The Observer. Covered the UK for 10 years up until the end of the 90s. Went to Kosovo, began working for the New York Times in Kosovo. That's where I met your good self. Stayed there for 5 years, then spent 5 years in the States, and then have been back in the UK for 10 years now, about 10 years.
And you've been really busy, I know, working for the New York Times and working obviously side by side with writers on the paper. But this, I think, has been one of the most challenging periods for you, hasn't it?
The COVID-19, it has. It's been pretty bizarre, mainly because you're just working by yourself. Reporters have tended, I think, because there was so much concern over journalists getting infected, that a lot of reporters have been staying inside. As a photographer, you have to be out and about. There's no choice. So it's been quite strange. The New York Times put a whole range of photographers across the world basically on assignment around the 13th of March. That's when I went on assignment. So that was 10 days before the lockdown. And it presented us with a bit of a problem because, as we'll see in the photos, very few people were taking any precautions whatsoever at that time. Right. But we went through this period where, we were wearing masks, wearing gloves, wearing goggles sometimes, but the general population was not doing any of that.
Well, I know we've got we've got a good range of your photos now. So
yeah,
if Isabel can bring those up, we can start to have a look at those.
Yeah, this is the first two were taken on the same day. So this is in North London in a supermarket, and this is the 13th of March. So panic buying was really setting in. You had this weird. I think it was to do with the mixed messaging coming from the government. So on the one hand, you had mass panic buying in all the supermarkets. This was the toilet roll aisle, and on the other hand, if you go to the next slide, same day, Columbia Road Flower Market. So obviously this was an incredibly dangerous thing. I mean, what struck me during this time was that I knew that these days were the most important days, were the most dangerous days in terms of catching the virus, because it was kind of moving through the population silently. But as you can see, no one here is wearing a mask. Everyone's fully close together. So it was strange for photographers because we a lot of people were sort of having a go at us for wearing masks, but we knew that was the only way to keep yourself safe as you were working.
So it's a surreal period of time when we look back at it, doesn't it? It just sort of seems bizarre in retrospect. Let's keep going through them.
Incredibly. So this is by Piccadilly Circus. At the time, we were sent out every day to try and find photographs. I mean, by this time, COVID-19 was such a huge story. The New York Times was running a live daily briefing, which would change as things occurred during the day. So there was just a need for photography. So this was down near Piccadilly Circus. Again, huge amounts of traffic, but people starting to wear masks. But it was still few and far between at that point.
And in terms of access at this time, it has been, you could obviously move around, and also talking to people. That was there wasn't a difficulty at that point.
Not at all. No. In fact, it wasn't a difficulty ever for me. Right. This is one of the strange things. I mean, we didn't really have a lockdown, as far as I can see. It was a partial lockdown, but it was not. It was never a full lockdown. I was never approached by a policeman to ask what I was doing.
Right.
No.
Right. Let's go on to the next one.
On to the next. This is the city of London. This is all before the lockdown, but this is when. So you had this. The government were trying to keep everyone. I think they were just trying to keep the economy going for as long as possible, but people started to take things into their own hands, take their kids out of school, stay at home. And so this was the city. The city just started emptying out. This was a few days before the lockdown. So people were taking it into their own hands.
In the evening when you'd expect people to be going out to bars and
bang on rush hour.
Busy. Yeah.
This is about 5 p.m., 5:30 p.m. So this is rush hour.
Okay, next. Andrew, you say next. When you've come to the, just ask us about the next one.
So this is again when the theatres closed. Again before the government went into lockdown. I was in town a few days before this, and the theatres were absolutely packed, and it was this strange, again, this kind of surreal situation where, if you were watching the news and paying close attention to the news, you knew that the virus was spreading and would hit really hard. But if when you're in the centre of London, I was there for the matinee time. It was absolutely packed. People still going to theatres, still going to bars, still going to restaurants, and you just had this kind of sense of impending doom, really, because you knew what was coming.
Yeah. Okay.
Next. This is Heathrow.
It's amazing now that we have this debate about whether quarantine from international arrivals is, way after the horse has bolted.
No, it's pretty incredible. I heard a theory that the reason they're doing that is just to try to keep Brits in the UK. I mean, it seems to make most sense to me. I mean, stop them from going abroad if you're facing 2 weeks quarantine.
For those of you who are listening in from Australia, the Home Secretary Priti Patel has introduced measures that would require anybody coming into the UK to go into quarantine for 14 days. So anybody coming from any flight has to self-quarantine, and there are some exceptions to that rule. Let's go to the next one.
So this was in Hampstead Heath. This was a class, it was a sort of yoga or Tai Chi class, but a socially distanced one, again before the lockdown. So people were taking things into their own hands before the government actually forced them to. And this woman, struggling with her pram across the front of people. I just thought it was
I think we need to rattle through some of these, because I'm quite keen to get to the period where, in the current, when the lockdown actually started to set in, and then how you were able or not able to tell the story then.
Sure. So again, here, this is day of the lockdown. This is just a security guard having a cigarette, but I just like this picture. It's an atmospheric picture, and he's wearing his gloves. So on to the next. So this is in lockdown. This is Good Friday. This was a really sad scene I came across by the Catholic Cathedral, Westminster Cathedral. They closed all churches in the UK under the lockdown, all churches, all mosques, all places of worship, synagogues. And I was walking around town. We were doing a big feature on Good Friday across the world, and I came across this woman who was in a pretty desperate shape. She was pretty upset, but she sat there praying for a good half an hour or more.
Pretty sad, yeah.
This is in North London. This was a curry house owner who started delivering food for NHS and for over 70s for free. You had this great. Once the lockdown came into effect, the British people really came out, and 750,000 of them volunteered to help. Volunteered with the government to help people who were shielding, vulnerable people, old people. The government actually didn't really utilise those people, but you found that restaurants, around the country were just switched from, they couldn't really open to have people sitting in the restaurants, so they switched and they started providing food for free and delivering it for free. It was really quite a huge sort of outpouring of empathy from the UK public.
So you managed, obviously been able to tell the story out on the streets, but the challenge you've had, and let's go to the next slide, has really been to dealing with the authorities. I mean, here you obviously can see the police of checking, you know, who's doing what in the parks. But in terms of actually getting to tell them the medical side of the story, that's been pretty tough, hasn't it?
That has been a huge frustration, I think, for all photographers. Yeah, this is police clearing a park. This is a homeless guy in Soho in London. You just have the juxtaposition of the umbrellas, which attracted me to that photograph. Yeah, that has been the main problem, trying to actually show what's happening in terms of, I mean, the UK, we have the, you know, this week, I think on the 2nd of June, we had the second highest death rate in the world. We have one of definitely the second highest death toll in the world. But actually showing that has been incredibly hard, and it's been very difficult to get access to hospitals, to morgues, to funeral homes. I mean, it all sounds pretty morbid, but I mean, as a photographer, as you know, Nick, we worked together in the Balkans during the conflicts over there. That's, you know, when things like this happen, you have to show this stuff, and you have to get access to these places to be able to show people what's actually happening. So you kind of had this weird bubble in the UK where, you know, we were watching Italy. And photographers had access to the hospitals in Italy, and there was horror amongst the UK population as we watched what was happening in Italy. And I vividly remember when 40 Italian health workers had died. There was just shock here. But, you know, we've got to face the fact that here now in this country, 180 NHS workers have died. We don't know how many care workers have died in the care homes. But
I think that's very interesting, because the images predominantly you've been able to show are sort of the daily life on the street, and in a way, it's a reflection of the inability to get access. And I know the BBC has had access to some of the wards, and we've seen the NHS in action, but we really haven't seen. And let's go to the next slide. The impact, I guess.
No, because it's all quite. It's all quite controlled, and you know, the NHS is not easy to. They're very, very concerned with the sort of patient anonymity. This photograph was from a temporary morgue. This was the only really morgue that I got access to. This was set up in a car park of a mosque in Birmingham, in Small Heath in Birmingham, and they were happy for me to spend a few days photographing them. This is actually a COVID-19 patient who died in prison, and they brought him back. They set up. They had these refrigeration units in the car park of the mosque where they could store up to 150 bodies. But again, so the guy in the middle is the funeral director, and all these guys, I'm sure, they're all going to have post-traumatic stress disorder, because it was just manic. They were trying to sort of help the authorities lessen the load of the number of bodies that were clogging up all the mortuaries. But again, we couldn't get access to those mortuaries, but they were telling us just how incredibly overcrowded and how the whole system was clogged. So you had
some people are going to take offence at, you know, why the hell should you have access to morgues? And someone's just written here now, is he serious? You know, why on earth should we be letting you have access to morgues and showing us that?
Well, why not? I mean, everyone's used to seeing photographs like that from war zones, or from tsunamis, or so why not? I mean, what makes us different from a third world country? Why is it okay to see that sort of stuff from Syria, and it's not okay to?
So, are you suggesting, is this deliberate? Are you thinking that? No,
I think people don't. So here in the UK, I mean, people don't really see that we have we have the second highest death toll in the world. That's not really people, and you actually see it on the street, because people are not really wearing masks. People are not really taking care. Whereas I think in Italy they did, because they saw what was going on in their hospitals. They saw what was going on in their morgues. They saw, the absolute crisis they were in. Whereas in this country, we hadn't seen it.
Right. So the sort of public's been insulated from the reality.
Exactly. It's like a weird kind of bubble where you're insulated from the reality. I mean, you have to see the reality. This was a priest who was traveling around giving sermons on the street in West London. Yeah, I think you have to see the reality. I mean, like it or not. I mean, it's happening, and it's our job to report on what's happening and to show the public what is happening. And I think that definitely British public had been insulated from the full horror. I mean, we according to ONS figures, according to the excess death figures, which is the figures that will really judge how many people died because of this pandemic, I mean, we're already in the 60,000s. So,
well, we're going to come on to how the government policy, how government has been handling it in a second. But let's just keep going through here.
Sure.
This is just opposite Parliament. This is the Treasury.
Yeah. Parliament Square. So, I mean, one thing here has been the huge number of cyclists now in town. You have thousands and thousands. So, the centre of town really emptied out from traffic, and you had instead the cyclists really took over, which was great to see. But you did worry about social distancing, as with everything. But yeah, this was one of the really positive aspects. Being in the centre of London, it was absolutely empty of cars, free of pollution. We had this beautiful run of incredible weather, and it was quite surreal just to be there, surrounded by cyclists and pedestrians and no cars.
I suppose that's the sort of part of the surreality of it, is the contrast between the sort of serenity and the wonderful weather we've had, and people enjoying nature, and then alongside one of the highest death tolls in the world.
Well, it was really brought home to me. I was photographing outside St Thomas's Hospital when Boris Johnson had COVID-19, and it was a scene similar to that last picture, with families cycling, and there were families bringing their children. They were all cycling through town, and as all these cyclists were crossing the road in front of St Thomas's, a homeless woman, walked over the bridge completely naked, with her trousers sort of around her ankles, obviously extremely distressed, filthy. And it was just this incredibly weird situation where exactly that, you had this beautiful weather, people enjoying the lack of pollution, but there was the reality of this woman who was completely lost. She had nothing, no backup, and she was just she had lost it so much that she was naked, and the police sort of took her away. But that really summed it up for me.
So, Andrew, what have you found that? I mean, in terms of actually getting to the story, what are the obstacles that you've had? I mean, you've talked about the morgues, and some people might question whether you should have access to those, and you've made a good answer to it. But what else? How else has it been difficult? What about the NHS, and in terms of actually just seeing how that works?
Again, very difficult. I had good contacts. We did a story about the NHS with Brexit a few years ago, and those contacts said that they could get me access, but it didn't happen. I think really they were very concerned with controlling the message. I've spoken to some nurses who have said that they were banned from talking to any media. I think because I really think the government has really tried to control the message, and they've done it very successfully. So there's been very little access to the NHS. The BBC got in, and after the peak of the pandemic, the NHS allowed some agencies in on a pool basis. So they would allow one photographer from an agency in, and then that photographer would then have to spread the photographs throughout, send the photographs to all media. But even with that, one of the photographers who was in, they recalled 20 of the photographs that he had taken. It's just a different, it's in the UK, so when you're working as we did in sort of conflict zones, there's just an acceptance there that seems to me that it's a valid thing that you're doing, then it's an important thing to show the reality. Here, they're very much, it seems that there's this whole kind of atmosphere of secrecy and trying to keep things hidden, which I think is really unhealthy. And that extends even even to number 10. I mean, these photographs of Boris Johnson that you're seeing on the front pages of most of the newspapers are actually taken by a photographer employed by him. He employs a photographer as a special advisor, so similar to the status of Dominic Cummings, and they have stopped allowing access or they've cut down access to the media, to the wire service photographers. And so a lot of the front pages you're seeing are photographs taken by a special advisor to Boris Johnson, which is a crazy. And also his last.
What photos have we got, Andrew? What have we got? What are we on to next?
That's the last one. That's the
last one. Okay. Well, that's been great. I mean, just as a last question, Andrew, and is it, although you might see the government trying to control the message, it's very much part of our sort of world of communications where you do try and control the message. You know, all companies and parts of the NHS, we want to present an image, and therefore we try and we do it. We're quite media astute, so it might not be Big Brother. I guess it might be the way we control this world anyway.
Yeah, no. For example, so Barack Obama, his administration tried the same thing. They had their own photographer, a very good photographer, and they tried to do a similar thing and impose that photographer's pictures on all. They tried to restrict access to the media, but in the newspapers, all the newspapers in America rebuffed that 100%, and that wasn't allowed to happen. I think the only photograph that was ever used from that photographer was the control room when Osama bin Laden was killed. That very famous photograph, because no other photographers could get access. But over here, there hasn't been that kind of pushback.
Right. Okay. Well, listen, thank you very much, Andrew. We're going to come back to Andrew in a second, and take him to task, ask as many nasty questions of him as you can. But thank you very much. First of all, I think, can we get Lyn Maddock up, Isabel? Lyn has got a good question there. I'll take a few minutes to come up there, and while we're doing that, Andrew, you're still there with us.
Yes.
Any thoughts about what Tom was saying there just now?
I thought his last point on the systemic failures was a very good one. The austerity cuts over the last 10 years, the effects of those, I think, have really come home to roost in this crisis. The lockdown that we had was not a particularly stringent one, and I saw that as I was wandering around. I mean, I was outside Buckingham Palace one day, and crowds were forming, and the police came and they moved the crowds away, and they said, "This is dangerous. You've got to move away. You've got to move away." They stayed for 5 minutes, and then they had to leave. And I said, "Well, why are you going? Why?" And they said, "Well, we don't have enough people." But I mean, so that directly. The police. This directly correlates to the fact that over the last 10 years, 20,000 police have been sacked. Now, if you due to austerity, if you had those extra police, it would make sense, just for example, to station one policeman outside Buckingham Palace every day, all day, to stop crowds forming, because with every 5 minutes a new crowd forms. They don't respect social distancing, etc. So in terms of that, also with the NHS not having adequate PPE, not having enough nurses, all these things I think link back to austerity. The fact that they didn't have enough beds and they had to send untested patients recovering from COVID-19 into care homes when everybody knew that was going to spread the virus, I think is symptomatic of the problems, the systemic problems that Tom was talking about.
Yeah, I guess there are two things there. One is money, and the other is actual, governance and how things are run. Lyn Maddock, who's also in Australia. Lyn, can you also just say a bit about your perspective, because you're an economist, but also you've worked in a range of government departments, so you've got some experience of managing big projects and also knowing the complexities of work, of handling policy and how you implement policy. So Lyn, but just preface your question, if you can, with a little précis about what your experience is. Lyn Maddock.
Thanks, Nicholas. Firstly, I think that we were lucky in some ways that we had the bushfires over Christmas, because that stopped a whole lot of tourists coming to Australia, particularly Chinese tourists. And our university didn't start till the end of February, so we avoided, and we closed down China very early, so we avoided Chinese students coming to Australia. And both of those helped a lot. I think the other thing to think about in the Australian terms is it's a fairly tight-knit little community, so that when you've got complex issues, it's relatively easy to get a fairly coordinated response to it. We also, unlike the UK, and I think this is quite significant, but this may be because of my background, we have a Prime Minister's department, so that the Prime Minister has a department of 500 people whose role is simply to coordinate across government. And I think that institutionally makes a difference. We also introduced a national cabinet, which was all the premiers and the Prime Minister sitting, making joint decisions. Again, although we've got 25 million people, that's, I think, a function of a fairly tight-knit community. So I think that they're sort of factors which go towards explaining why we've got 100 deaths compared to the amount in the UK, US, Western Europe, etc. My question is that as you sit from afar, like Chrissy, you get stunned by the incompetence of the British response, but that's pretty much relying upon written reports. And I'm really interested in the comments that Andrew made as to whether the lack of vision has affected how the British people see things, and then whether the Emily Matlis's comments on the whatever the program was on BBC about Cummings, whether they achieved a cut through that previous written reports hadn't.
So I think we're now into the realm of opinion here, Andrew. So rather than your role as a photographer, but go for it. Go on.
So the first part of the question again. The second part was only mateless. The first part was.
I was interested in your comment that the lack of vision had affected how.
Yeah, I think that's key. You know, just from having been here and the public living through what we saw in Spain and Italy, we had, because don't forget, we had a couple of weeks or even more than that to watch what was going on there and to prepare. We had that time to prepare, and you know, the scenes being shown from Italy and Spain truly horrified people here. I mean, it has been a really weird thing. But when the epidemic hit here, I think the lack of access and the fact that we haven't really seen, even though the BBC were allowed in. I mean, after I think it was Fergus, I can't remember his name. He actually wrote a piece afterwards saying that he was very tightly controlled and he would have liked to have shown more. But you know, it actually. You don't have to, when you're in those wards. I mean, people say, oh, it's really heartless, you shouldn't be abusing people like that. But actually, when you're in those wards, you're not actually going to identify those people because people have masks over their faces. So you're not really invading privacy. And you do find in those situations, in situations of crisis, that people are usually very happy to be photographed. So I think that the fact that we haven't seen the reality of what's going on the ground in the UK has had a massive effect, and it's insulated people from the problem. And, you know, Tom was right. When he goes out in the streets, it's as if nothing's happening. It's as if nothing's wrong. So it's this weird kind of disconnect that goes on. And I think that a large reason for it is that. I mean, as morbid as it may seem, when you're not seeing what's happening at the sharp end, you don't have a full understanding.
Lyn, I'm just going to come back to your point about cooperation in government. The Cabinet Office is responsible for coordinating the cooperation between ministries, and Michael Gove is the chap who's meant to be communicating between the different ministries. And you know, these are very tried and tested, you know, means of executing policy. Yet it does seem as though the coordination and the long-term strategy is just not there. I think it was also we've seen a struggle between cabinet, so government and the ministries and the Cabinet Office, but then also number 10 concentrating power and decision making in a small circle of people and you know, private advisors like Dominic Cummings. And I think that tension might explain part of the breakdown in some of these processes, but that's just my view. Simon Jackson has got a good question, and I think this was. And Andrew, you can come to this as well. Simon, are you there? Let's bring Simon Jackson's microphone up. We can.
Hi, I was. I suppose I was interested in the general quality of the of press reporting, in the sense that do the majority of reporters within the COVID press pack, do they do their homework in order to generate interesting and informative questions, or is there other some, too many possibly, who are looking for when did you stop beating your wife questions purely to generate headlines?
I think this is a hard one for answer, and I don't know whether Andrew can answer that. What I would say is about from the New York Times is perhaps a different animal on the amount of rigor that's required when you're doing a story for the New York Times is substantial. There's far more fact checking. There is an editorial process that involves 3 to 4 levels of editors going through your copy before it gets published. And whilst you might want to get a good headline, it's quite hard to just, it's very difficult to have opinion-driven journalism. And there's a contrast in the States between broadcasters in the States can be far more opinion-led, and the print tends to have more vigor, and it's the other way around here in the UK. But Andrew, can you, obviously you're out and about, you've got a good impression of you get to see how other reporters are working. Have
Sure.
you been impressed by them? Have you been disappointed by them? What contact have you had?
Well, I've been working exclusively for the New York Times, and you're right, they have a much higher standard than most British newspapers, I would say, much more higher, much more rigorous. But the New York Times, they had a few deaths over in New York early on, and so they were keeping their reporters on a very tight leash. For example, if I would needed to actually go inside anywhere to photograph, I would have to put that back to New York for approval with their security guy. So they insisted on full PPE. They insisted on a lot of things. So they were extremely rigorous, and they're not really interested in the sort of, did you beat your wife question. So I can't really comment on those. But I don't think a journalist really need to set the government up for a fall. They're doing such a good job themselves.
I think we'll have to get you arranged. We'll have to get some tabloid reporters for you, and why not? And maybe that's something we should do. That would
absolutely. Get the Daily Star. Why did the Daily Star change its long-term policy? Did you see the front page? It was quite a front page.
Go tell us about that, Andrew.
The Dominic Cummings mask. I have it downstairs. The Daily Star has a policy of never touching politics, but they did on Dominic Cummings, which shows the amount of cut through that story has. And they made this little mask, which they put on the front page, and it was, forget about the rules and do whatever the hell you want mask. So just put this mask on and do whatever you want, and you'll get away with it. So.
And it was Dominic. It was Dominic Cummings' face. Yeah. Okay. Let's go to that. Well, listen, I'm keen to, we've sort of moved into the section of our conversation where I want to hear your views. Andrew, unless Andrew's phone goes, and the reason why we've done this talk early in the UK time is that both Tom and Andrew have commitments during the day, so we've got them early. But I'm going to try and get Andrew to stay on for a few more minutes if he can. And we can bounce ideas off him. Louise Tarrant has got a good question. If we can bring Louise up, and then Margie Grosswent in Hawaii also has got a good question. So Louise, let's bring Louise up first. If we can get Louise's microphone up. Have we got Louise's microphone coming? Yeah, Louise, you're there. Go ahead and ask.
Thanks for that. So Andrew, given we heard earlier about the government and NHS and others wanting to really control the narrative, images are always iconic parts of that narrative control. And so from afar, what we see is not the morbidity and solemnity of deaths and morgues and hospitals being overcrowded, but rather lots of communities applauding NHS workers. You see lots of people in streets, socially distant, but having a volunteer run an exercise class. So there's this overwhelming sense of a community coming together in a collective effort and a sense of cohesion. So one is, you know, masterful composition or reality, and the second is, does that go, do you think, in part way, and I get this as opinion, but how does that respond to the sort of the deep divisions of Brexit? Is that part of a healing or a coming together, or is that just a moment in time?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? Just to chip in there, Andrew, I think we are seeing splits. I mean, certainly since the Cummings affair, if you like, that sort of undermining of public confidence, but also splits along the same lines of Remain and Leave. So there was a really good cartoon which they had two protesters, and one that said Remain was the big word on their poster, and it said Remain inside, and then the other one said Leave home. and it did reflect as an ideological divide. You know, the more libertarian pro-Brexit ones thinking we need to get the economy back online, and then the sort of more liberal ones saying we need to protect society and stay inside. So,
Yeah.
so Andrew, your views, go on.
Yeah, no, it has followed that, hasn't it? At the end, seeing those photographs of you know, the people applauding the NHS, that's all fantastic. But again, that's, you know, if you take the whole picture, that's just half the picture, and that has, you know, the NHS and the struggles of the NHS did unite the country, but, you know, in one way. But I don't think, in terms of Brexit, I think the COVID-19 has actually accentuated the differences between the countries and has not united. I think if you look at Northern Ireland, they decided, I mean, you had a few weeks ago, Arlene Foster, when Boris Johnson changed our slogan from stay home to stay alert, Arlene Foster came out very strongly and said we will not be following England, which was a huge deal in Northern Ireland. And they have decided to maybe a lot more cooperation with the Republic of Ireland, which makes sense because there's actually no border. So you have a different regime in Northern Ireland, and a couple of hundred yards down the road where there's no, you know, there's an invisible border in Ireland, you have a completely different regime. So I think it's and Scotland has made clear, and Wales, that they are diverging from decisions that England are making. So in that way, I think it's actually accentuating the differences. I think everybody came together in sympathy and, you know, in their willingness to help the NHS, but that was for an institution, not for a sense of, you know, national unity.
Yeah. I don't know if Howard Gatiss is still online, but I'd love Howard to come up because he had a few questions for Andrew earlier on, which I thought were good. So if Howard is still online, I'd love to hear from him. In the meantime, we've got Margie in Hawaii. Do you want to go ahead, Margie? What's your point? And I know that Andrew may not be able to answer this, but we may have views on it. So go ahead, Margie in Hawaii. You need to turn your microphone on. We've got you up. We just need to make sure your microphone's on. If you want to check your microphone, Margie. Well, I'm going to ask the question for her. There she is. Go on, Margie, go on. Can you go on, far away?
Okay, so we heard about this Imperial College of London model, which was absolutely terrifying. And everyone locked down. I mean, everyone was talking about it. Everyone locked down. Hawaii has done really well. I was just looking at the difference between the UK. We've had 24 deaths per 1 million, and yours is way above that. I mean, we just locked down. But it was that Imperial College of London model, which I think was disproved. Curious how that affected UK.
That's the Neil Ferguson model,
yeah.
I think. The
Right.
the 500,000. Well, actually, at the time, I kind of remember that the British government kind of poo-pooed that a little bit, and they were talking about 250,000 dead. Now that our death toll has reached such heights, they now bring in that 500,000 figure. But I don't know if it's been.
The 500,000 figure was based on the idea of having no. It would be the consequence of having no measures whatsoever. So that's
Sure.
what that was based on. So it's taken slightly out of context. But sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that it has been disproved. I mean, we won't know, but yeah, I think they downplayed that a little bit at the time. They talked about the 250,000. Again, that's part of this weird kind of disconnect that we've been talking about earlier. I mean, you saw the Imperial College figures and and took action. We saw the Imperial College figures and we didn't. And I think everyone has to admit that we did not lock down early enough, and also we did not lock down well enough. If you look at France, if you look at Spain, if you look at Italy, I mean, they had a full lockdown. You couldn't leave your home. If you did, there were police patrols stopping you. You had to fill out a form saying what you were doing. They would check if you had receipts, and it was a penal. There were fines and possible prison times if you broke the lockdown. Here, we never had that, and so you actually had this weird situation where the centre of town, City of London and the West End, was absolutely empty. It was eerily empty. But once you got out in the suburbs, everyone was out and about, really, and the police couldn't stop them. So yeah, we should have acted earlier, but we didn't.
If you've got any more thoughts or comments, please do sort of raise them in the Q&A section, or just raise your hand. I mean, I think just for the sake of balance, I mean, I would say that there's a strong contingent of people within the UK population, also within the Conservative Party as well, who think that these lockdown measures are way too much, and in actual fact that we should embrace the consequences of the disease, and that we really need to get the economy working. And we may see a death toll that's increased, but we really need to get people back to work. And if more elderly people die, that's what we have to face, and we need to get on with things.
Well, I mean, I think the way the government has done it, and maybe probably unintentionally, and they didn't realise, we've had the worst of both worlds. I think if you lock down early and you lock down hard, then you would be able to come out of the lockdown. I mean, Kosovo, where we both worked 20 years ago during the war, locked down before they even had a death, and that was a full lockdown. No flights, all borders closed, no one in, no one out, and they are now fully out. So it was a tough one for sure. I mean, it was who would want to have to make that decision? But I think if you look at the countries that really locked down hard, they are now able to come out, and they will get their economies going better than we will, because we haven't even got it down to a manageable number of new infections. We're still on 8,000 infections a day in England, outside hospitals and outside care homes. So the true number of UK infections, including hospitals and care homes, who knows? So You need to get that down so that you can track and trace and then control the virus, which is what Germany did from the get-go.
Yeah. Okay, guys, I think we've had a really good discussion. We've answered everyone's questions. Unless I see another question pop up here that's new, I think we're going to. Oh no, I do have a few more here actually. That I'll take that back. Sheila de Balague has got a good question, and then one from Anna Logan. So let's bring those up too, and then we'll wrap up after that. So if we can bring Sheila de Balague's microphone up, that would be good. Sheila, can you hear us? We just have to wait for a second.
My question to Andrew.
Yeah, there we go. Sheila, go on, far away.
Can you hear? Okay.
Yes.
If more photography and filming had been allowed in hospitals and morgues and care homes, do you think that would have made a material and even perhaps a helpful difference to the attitude of the public, and therefore that following on to that to the government, as to how the pandemic should be managed?
I do, and I look at Italy and Spain, and I look the level of when people saw the reality of what was happening in their hospitals, they respected the lockdown really well. I think, the fact that they could see it meant that they understood it, and they were able to, and they didn't mind. I mean, people, of course, they minded, and they had harsh fines and threat of arrest if they broke the lockdown, but it meant that they accepted it better. I think we've had this situation here where we know in the back of our minds, we hear these figures that there's so many people dying, even though there's so many different levels of figures. I mean, the tested positive for COVID, the ones where COVID on the death certificate, and then the excess deaths. We have 3 levels, which I don't think is helpful. But we have that in the back of our mind, but then we go outside and everything, and there's people on the street, things look kind of normal. So I think people let their guards down.
I completely agree, because we were all terrified when we saw the pictures of Italy, but then we weren't shown similar pictures of what was going on here, and we should have been.
Yes, I think so. I think we should have been, yeah. And maybe afterwards there can be some sort of discussion about that in the media.
Because the pictures have more effect eventually on a wider proportion of the public than words, basically. And if it had on the television and the nation's television screens, it would have had a big effect.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you for that, Sheila. Anna Logan, you've got an interesting question as well. If we bring Anna up. Group Anna's there. We've got Anna.
Yes. Yes.
Go on, Anna.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. We in Australia have certain payments that we make to job seekers and job keepers. But a lot of people here were impressed by the UK system of paying, I think it is 80% of a worker's salary when they lost their job. How do people in the UK regard this policy?
Well, I'd love to get other people's reactions on that too. I'll chip in here. But Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, has been praised for the amount of support that he has provided, both in terms of people getting direct salaries, and there have been grants to companies at a local level. And I think the government has been praised more generally for that. There are some people in more conservative circles who are worried about the amount of sort of prime pumping, like quantitative easing, the amount of money that's been put into the system, or will that create an inflationary stimulus later on? But there's certainly no evidence that the economy is going to be hit very, very hard in the short term. So generally, I think the government's action has been well received. Andrew, what's your personal view on that?
No, I think so. Yeah, I think they've got that right. I think they people are very appreciative of that, and I think it buys them a lot of time. I mean, they're faced with a problem that if they didn't do something like that, then I think people would be, there would be such levels of anxiety within the population that, that people would be at breaking point. But I think it's, they've done the right thing, and they've done it in a timely way. And I think it's been a very good policy.
And how long is it to go on for?
Sorry, Anna.
How long is it to go on for?
I think they're going to start asking businesses to contribute, which again is going to cause a problem, because a lot of businesses will find a way to, I think will find that very hard, and may try and find a way to lose people rather than contributing. But I think that's going to come in August now. I think, Nick, you know.
I can't recall now on that one.
I think it's in August. They're on.
Richard Murphy, you still online? Richard?
Hold on, I've unmuted. Yes, I'm still here.
Yeah. So Richard? Tell us about your background, because you do have a sort of relevant view. What's been your perception of the government's action when it comes to financial stimulus and salaries?
Yeah, it's that wasn't the question I thought you were going to ask me, because obviously my background is as an actuary and all the mortality and stuff. But yes, I mean, I think again it's seen as incredibly positive. And certainly my wife, the reason I changed room from where we started is she's now, because she's a local councillor, they're trying to get the money out, and even from the smallest businesses, getting them grants, to the largest businesses, getting them access to finance. There really have been mechanisms there. And I think there is the most striking point was the one made a few minutes ago, that actually, if we end up in the worst of both worlds, where we end up with an uncontrolled but lower level pandemic, compared to the rest of the countries around us, how do we keep going with this support for business? So it's really the next month or two are going to be critical, and we just have to see how does the government manage it.
What was the question you thought I was going to ask?
Well, I think just around, I mean, I can certainly back the comments of what was going on in early March, where there was a real understanding developing in, you know, sort of in actuarial circles, but in other circles of how the disease was working and how it was spreading in the population. And there was that horror, you know, around mid-March that we understood what was happening, but nothing was being implemented in the UK, whereas we could see countries like Ireland, who, you know, stopped, you know, the St. Patrick's Day parades. And even looking back, talking to them now, they stopped the Ireland-Italy game, but they didn't ban the Italians from travelling. And that's seen as something where, you know, the government is admitting and being honest, actually, we should have done more. And that's this challenge here where the government is not admitting anything. And so it's hard to have an intelligent conversation about what you do next if you say, well, we didn't make mistakes.
Richard, just say what you do, just in a bit more detail.
I've just stopped being a scheme actuary. I worked for the last 30 years advising pension funds, and so, you know, tracking mortality is our game. And actually, there was, just to say to people who are really interested, there's a lot of material now out there, particularly being produced in the last couple of weeks, as to what's going on with the underlying numbers. We're not seeing them from government, but when they say it's too early to judge, I think you can go out and find that material. If you go to the Institute of Actuaries site in the UK, there will be links there to all sorts of analysis of what's happening.
Okay, so can you just give us a brief overview of some of those numbers? I mean, I know some of those numbers loosely, but just give us a couple of comments.
Actually, there's I'm going to hesitate slightly because it's actually there's a terrific, what sounds like a terrific seminar bringing all of these things together. That's actually on at 3 o'clock today, running through them for a couple of hours. But as well as always trying to work out which numbers people are most interested in. I mean, we've had the 8,000 quoted, but I mean, these excess deaths where you just go and measure, you know, what would we have expected to have happened compared to what the actual deaths that we're seeing week by week. I mean, this number has gone well over 60,000, where the government's quoting numbers of 30-something thousand. I mean, there's a real disconnect and a lack of trust then for people with expertise in what the government is doing. Are they basing their decisions on bad numbers, or are they telling us bad numbers, but actually the underlying people who are making decisions understand what's going on? So I was worried. Are they lying to us, or are they deluding themselves?
Okay, that's a very good question to end the whole thing with. Well, Andrew, thank you very much for your for staying online for so long. It's been a really interesting discussion. I know that we've got some members of our group who will, you know, not share some of these views and will be, you know, more critical of, well, perhaps more supportive of the government and more inclined that we should be opening the economy up. We'll just find out who's right. But I very much enjoyed that last quote from Richard there. I thought that was very apt. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Do join us next Tuesday, when we'll have the former South African ambassador Nozipho January Bardell and also the former editor of the Star newspaper in Johannesburg, Peter Sullivan. They'll be discussing Mandela's legacy and what went wrong with his legacy. So do join us then. We're also scheduling some additional talks for this month, and we're going to be speaking to Professor Tom Holt, who's a historian of basically race and racism in the United States. And we'll be looking at Black Lives Matter and the recent protests taking place in the States. And that talk should be scheduled for a week Tuesday, but we'll send you confirmation of those timings. So once again, do join us on Tuesday when we'll be looking at Mandela's legacy. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. It's been a really good discussion. Goodbye from us now. We'll see you online very shortly. Bye for now.